Okay, this is podcast number 1 for standard 5.2. This standard is basically broken down in 2 parts. In the first part, we're going to describe species as reproductively distinct organisms. And then we are going to learn how we classify species into different taxonomic systems, including kingdom, phylums, classes, orders, all the way down to a species. Okay, and we're also going to take a look at speciation within the standard and how new species form. So you will be able to describe a species. You'll describe reproductive isolation, which is a mechanism used to make new species. And we'll look at the taxonomic system. And we're going to describe the process of speciation using Darwin's finches as an example. And we'll finally be looking at cladograms as a way of showing evolutionary relationships. So here's some of the vocab that you're going to see in here. We've been talking a lot about these before, like species and speciation. We'll go over the entire taxonomic system and look at the different ways that species can become reproductively isolated from each other. So let's first begin by just saying what a species is. So remember, a species is any group of organisms that, number 1, have similar traits. So they have to have some kind of similarity to each other. Clearly they're chickens in this picture. They might not all look identical to each other, but they are clearly of the same species. But more important than that is the fact that whatever members are of a species, they can reproduce, and when they reproduce, they make fertile offspring. That means that their offspring are also able to reproduce. So there's examples of different kinds of species that have formed that aren't true species because they are unable to reproduce. An example of that is the donkey. If you take a horse and a mule, you make a donkey. The problem with the donkey is that it is infertile. It cannot make its own offspring. So it's not a true species. And the mule and the horse are different species. Even though they were able to reproduce, and they do look similar to each other, their offspring are not fertile that they end up making. So the process by which we make a new species is called speciation. And it usually will take millions of years to occur. So this is not something that is going to happen in your lifetime. You're not going to see a brand new species suddenly pop up. It's a very gradual, slow process. And it is almost always controlled by environmental changes. Remember, when the environment changes, that's going to cause changes in the gene pool, because only the members that are able to best survive those changes are going to reproduce, and they'll pass on the traits that allow them to survive. So this is an example of some fruit flies. Here we had a group of fruit flies that were happily living together, and they were separated into 2 groups. One group was given maltose as its food source, and the other was given starch. And they let many, many, many generations pass, eating only that particular food source, to the point where they actually developed into separate species. And when they put the 2 groups back together, the maltose flies would only go with the maltose flies, and the starch flies would only mate with other starch flies. So they had become distinct, separate species. They were separated geographically because they were put into different tanks, and also because they started to eat different foods that was going to have make a difference in their behaviors and possibly even their chemical makeup over a long, long period of time. So what had to happen with those fruit flies is they had to become reproductively isolated in order for this to happen. So in order for any new species to form, a group of the same species have to become unable to reproduce together for some reason. The main ways that this happens, there's behavioral isolation, there is geographic isolation, and there is temporal isolation. So if any of these 3 things happen, and sometimes it's a combination of more than one of them, but members of a species become unable to reproduce together for whatever reason, they could eventually evolve into separate, distinct species that when you try to put them back together, they will not reproduce because they cannot. So let's take a look at what each of these looks like. We're going to start with behavioral isolation. So in behavioral isolation, 2 populations have very different courtship rituals or other mating behaviors. Okay, so this could be songs, dancing, nest building, the colors. Usually with behavioral isolation, it is the female that is choosing the male. And the female will look at the male. The male is usually the prettier or they're better looking, especially in bird populations. So in this one, the female's looking and says, does it come in any other colors? Not really liking what it's seeing here. Because the female will look at certain behaviors and say, oh, this particular male has very good genes because it can do these things. And that's the one that it wants to mate with because it wants to have offspring with the best possible genes. So it could be in colors. This one here, they're talking about a courtship dance. Okay, the male's doing the courtship dance and the females are watching, and they're just like, huh, what's going on up there? And if they like the way that he's dancing, then they'll mate with him. If they don't like the way he's dancing, then that says there's something wrong with your genes. I'm not going to dance with you. Or I'm not going to mate with you, excuse me. Okay, so that's behavior. So behaviors are kind of a weird thing to think about, but it does happen in a lot of species in the wild that they are looking for certain types of traits that they want that says that they are strong members of the group, and so they want to mate with them and get those genes. Geographic isolation is just what it sounds like. If two populations become geographically or physically separated from each other, then obviously they're not going to be able to reproduce. So they could get separated by mountains, rivers, islands, large bodies of water, whatever is going to keep two groups from getting to each other so that they can reproduce, that's going to be a geographic isolation. And a lot of times we talked about before with the continental drift and the Pangea, a lot of the species were all together, and then as the continents began to move further and further away from each other, this pushed geographic isolation where the species were no longer able to get to each other in order to reproduce, and then they eventually became separate species. An example of this in the United States are these two species of mice. These are two different species of mice that are geographically isolated by the Rocky Mountains. So there's a mountain range between them. They have a common ancestor that somehow got separated by these mountains along the way. And if you look at these two mice, they look very similar to each other. But if you put them together, they will not reproduce together because they have become separate species. Okay. The final type of reproductive isolation is temporal isolation. Okay. Temporal isolation is when two species are going to reproduce at different times of the year, or it could be different times even of the day if we're talking about flowers. Okay. So like frogs, some species of frogs will reproduce in the spring, others reproduce in late summer. So if you're a species of frog that reproduces in the spring, you're not going to be able to mate with one that reproduces in the summer, because you're mating at different times, so your body is not going to be ready to mate at that particular time. You also can see this with flowers. Certain flowers will only bloom in the morning or in the afternoon, and that is when they are able to reproduce. And so they only can reproduce with the same species that is reproducing at that same time. So here are our three types of reproductive isolation. Once again, these are all isolating mechanisms, so we're going to take one group and we're going to separate it. They can be separated behaviorally, geographically, or temporally. If any of those or any combination of those happen, you will end up with independently evolving populations, and that will eventually lead to the formation of new species. Remember, this whole formation of new species takes millions of years to happen. So an example of speciation that's been well documented is actually with Darwin's finches. There are 14 different species of finch that live on the Galapagos Islands. Remember, Darwin spent quite a bit of time on the Galapagos Islands investigating what was happening there with all the different animals, and he noticed that there was a bunch of these finches, these birds, all over the place, and they all looked kind of similar to each other, but there were some differences. So they were all similar size and coloring, but what he noticed is that they had different beak shapes, and those shapes of their beaks depended on the food that was available to them in the particular region they were living in. So if they had to be able to crack open nuts, then they needed to have a big, strong beak. If they had to be able to dig into wood to get termites, then they needed a thinner beak that they could kind of dig in with. So depending on their food source, they developed different beak shapes. What we know from DNA analysis is that all of the finches that are on the Galapagos Islands actually share a common ancestor from the mainland of South America, and they are genetically similar to those mainland finches. So they looked at the DNA, looked at the current finches, and they've actually found that they are genetically similar. And so the hypothesis is that either when the continents were closer together, the birds were all living together and got separated, or some of the birds might have found their way over to the islands by floating on driftwood and kind of making their way over to the islands, but they became an isolated species. Now, once they were on the islands, they then also became more isolated. So if you look at the species, this is the species that's on South America, and this is what it looks like. And these are some of the varieties of finches that are on the Galapagos Islands. And they're all finch species, but they are slightly different, and they are different, you can see, by their beak shapes. Depending on what their food source is, they're going to have a different shape of a beak. Now, the reason they ended up adapting in this way is this process of speciation kind of happened in these steps. First of all, there was the founder population. That was that first group that arrived from the mainland, that first group that was kind of went over to the Galapagos Islands. And when they got there were very little predators around, and there was not a lot of competition. So the population thrived, and it got really, really, really big. The problem is when a population gets really big, you start to get a struggle for existence. And the birds started to compete with each other for food. So what had to happen is that founder population had to begin to separate into different groups that were better at getting different types of food. So if you were a finch and you were trying to get food from a nut and you didn't have the right kind of beak, you weren't going to get that food, and you were either going to die or you were going to have to start to eat a different kind of food. So that founder population just on the main island started to kind of separate into different groups based on different food types, but there was still too much competition. So a lot of the groups then started to migrate off into the different islands that make up the Galapagos Islands, and they became reproductively isolated both geographically and behaviorally. So they were geographically isolated because they were living on different islands, and they became behaviorally isolated because they really didn't want to mate with somebody that had a different kind of beak than them. And that became, kind of the thing, like, oh, you're not going to be able to provide the beak that my children need, so I'm not going to mate with you. And so there was this isolation that happened. And over millions of years, the finches on the Galapagos Islands eventually evolved into 14 distinct and separate species. Okay, so this is kind of showing you all of this. This is called adaptive radiation. So we had a ancestral species, and they're the ones that kind of went back, and they were the first founding group at the islands. And then from there, it radiated out into all of these different types based on the type of food that they were able to eat. So this whole group over here were insect-eating ones. Now, if all of them were on the same island and they were eating insects, you might have a problem. So some of them had to move over and go to different islands so that they could get enough food. Here, your sea eaters down here, again, too many to be living on one island, so they probably separated and went to some of the different islands. And that's how you eventually ended up with all of these different species.